The trucker's refusal. The small, dusty spaceport on the outskirts of the galaxy wasn't the place for an honest man to expect a good deal. In fact, most people here were either running from something or trying to escape the law. The truckers who passed through knew it was best to keep their heads down and avoid making waves. Today was no different for Jack Ironclad Renner, a weathered space trucker who had been hauling cargo through this corner of space for years. Jack's ship, the Iron Beast, was one of the toughest around. Its old hull had seen more than its fair share of battles, and it wasn't the sleekest or fastest ship, but it could take a beating and keep going. Jack wasn't exactly a hero. He was a man who cared about one thing: getting paid and getting out. He had no patience for the nonsense of the galaxy. His latest job had taken him to this out-of-the-way planet, delivering a load of unimportant supplies to a buyer who was already late with payment. As Jack stood on the loading dock, looking over his ship, he noticed a small figure approaching him. It was a girl, an alien, of course. She was tiny, not more than 4 feet tall, with pale blue skin that shimmered slightly under the harsh sunlight. Her eyes were wide, almost glowing with a soft green light. She wore tattered clothes that looked like they were stitched together from scraps of various fabrics. She had an air of fragility about her, like someone who had seen too much and was trying to hold themselves together in a harsh world. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a voice that was surprisingly clear and soft for someone so small. Jack didn't know why, but her presence felt different, something unsettling in the way she stood there, looking up at him with those bright, shining eyes. He grunted in response, wiping his hands on his worn-out jacket. "What do you want, kid?" His voice was rough, like gravel grinding under a heavy boot. He wasn't in the mood for any distractions today. "I need to get off this planet," she said, stepping closer. "I'll give you anything you want in exchange for a ride." Jack eyed her warily. He had heard these kinds of stories before. The desperate pleas from people stranded on dead-end planets, trying to get away from something or someone. He had a job to do, and he didn't have time for this. Besides, he wasn't about to pick up some alien passenger without a decent payment. "No deal," Jack said flatly, shaking his head. "I don't take passengers unless the money's good. And right now, I'm not in the mood to play hero." He turned away from her, preparing to finish up his work and head to the cantina for a drink. But the girl didn't leave. She just stood there, staring at him with those wide, pleading eyes. "Please, sir, I have nothing," she said. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet, but Jack could hear the desperation in it. Jack sighed, turning back around to face her. "Listen, I've been in this game long enough to know when someone's trying to pull a fast one. I've got my own problems. The last thing I need is some extra baggage." She nodded, as if she understood. And then, to Jack's surprise, she reached into her ragged coat and pulled out a small, glowing object. It was a crystal, no bigger than the palm of her hand, but it shimmered with a strange light. The air around it seemed to hum, almost as if it was alive. "This is all I have," she said, holding it out to him. "It's worth more than money, I promise." Jack didn't know why, but something about the crystal caught his attention. It didn't seem like any tech he had ever seen before. The glow was soft but powerful, like it held some kind of energy. It felt almost alive, like it had a purpose. He shook his head, pushing the strange feeling aside. "I'm not interested in your trinkets," he said, his voice colder now. "I came here for a job, not to play show me your magic rock." The girl's face didn't change. She didn't seem angry or upset, just calm, almost resigned. "Then, I have nothing else to offer, but you will regret this." Jack's brow furrowed. "Regret? Kid, I've seen it all. Don't come at me with cryptic nonsense. I've got a ship to fix." Without another word, he turned away from her and went back to his ship. He heard her footsteps behind him for a moment, but then they stopped. Jack didn't look back. His thoughts were already on the trip ahead. Get the cargo delivered, get paid, and then get out. Simple as that. As he climbed into the iron beast and started the engines, the last thing he heard was the girl's soft voice, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "You'll regret it." Jack snorted to himself as he settled into the pilot's seat. He didn't have time for superstitions. He was a man of facts, not fairy tales. And whatever that girl had said, he wasn't about to let it change his course. The universe was harsh, and people were out for themselves. That's how it worked. But as he lifted off from the dusty surface and shot into the stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had just happened, something he couldn't quite explain. The trucker had refused her payment, and the consequences were yet to unfold. The mysterious gift. The stars stretched out in front of Jack as the iron beast cut through the endless blackness of space. His ship rumbled with the familiar hum of the engines, a sound he'd grown used to over the years. But today, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The strange girl and her cryptic words kept echoing in his mind. "You'll regret it." The phrase seemed to float in the cold emptiness, like a shadow that clung to his thoughts. He tried to focus on the task at hand. He had a delivery to make, a job to complete. But as the hours dragged on, his thoughts drifted back to the girl and the glowing crystal she had offered him. What was it? He had never seen anything like it before. For a moment, he almost considered taking it. But then the thought passed. No time for distractions. Jack glanced at the small cockpit control panel. The ship's systems were running smoothly, but something felt off. The air seemed thick, charged with an invisible energy. He pulled the glowing crystal from his pocket, where he had tossed it earlier without a second thought. The moment his fingers wrapped around it, the ship's lights flickered. The crystal pulsed softly in his hand, and the ship's engines sputtered, as if caught in the same strange rhythm. The vibrations through the floor were subtle at first, then grew more intense, vibrating through the entire ship. Jack's brow furrowed. What the hell was happening? Before he could check the control systems, the ship lurched forward, throwing him back against the seat. Panic surged through him as the controls slipped from his grasp, and the ship veered off course. Lights blinked wildly on the dashboard, warning bells blared, and the ship rattled like a loose piece of scrap. His heart raced. What in the stars? He slammed his hand on the console, trying to regain control, but it was no use. The ship was no longer responding to his commands. The crystal in his hand was glowing brighter now, pulsing with energy. His palms grew slick with sweat as he struggled to understand what was happening. The ship lurched again, and for a moment, everything went still. It was as if time had frozen. And then, the strangest thing happened. A soft, low hum filled the cabin, coming from the crystal. It wasn't like the noise of the ship's engines. It was something deeper, almost otherworldly. The hum seemed to resonate in Jack's bones, vibrating through him in a way that was both unsettling and oddly calming. Suddenly, the ship's systems flickered back to life. The lights stopped flashing, the alarms quieted, and the controls returned to normal. Jack hesitated, his hand still gripping the controls, eyes wide with disbelief. What had just happened? He looked down at the crystal, now resting in his palm, and for the first time, felt an undeniable pull to it. It felt warm, alive even. He had no idea what it was, but the strange connection he felt to it was undeniable. The ship, once erratic and unstable, now seemed to be flying smoother than ever. Jack's hands hovered over the controls, unsure of what to do next. The ship was on course again, heading towards its next destination, but something had changed. He couldn't explain it, but the crystal had done something that had saved his life. Jack took a deep breath and placed the crystal back into his pocket. He didn't know if it was a gift or a curse, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. The girl's warning kept ringing in his ears. You'll regret it. But Jack wasn't the kind of man to regret things. He had never been the one to second-guess himself, and he wasn't about to start now. Whatever had happened, he'd get to the bottom of it. With a final glance at the glowing starfield outside his window, Jack leaned back in his seat. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble he had just gotten into, but he had a feeling it was far from over. He had made his choice, and the universe, it seemed, was going to make him pay for it. The unexpected encounter. Space, vast and infinite, could be a lonely place. Jack had spent years cruising through its endless void, delivering goods to planets that often felt more like barren rocks than thriving worlds. But tonight, as the Iron Beast sailed through the star-filled expanse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The strange incident with the crystal lingered in his mind, its eerie hum still echoing in the back of his skull. He had been hoping that it was just a weird glitch, a random event, something he could forget once he reached his next stop. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The feeling of unease was growing stronger. Suddenly, a sharp blip echoed through the ship's communication system. Jack's eyes darted to the console. A red light blinked on, signaling an incoming transmission. He hesitated for a moment, then flicked a switch, listening carefully as the static cleared. Jack Renner. A voice crackled through the speakers. It wasn't a voice he recognized. This wasn't a routine check-in or a transmission from a client. The voice sounded cold, almost mechanical, but with an odd sense of urgency. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Jack's stomach twisted. He had never been one to get spooked, but the suddenness of the message sent a chill down his spine. His fingers tightened around the controls, and he quickly scanned the ship's readings. No sign of any nearby ships. No threats in range. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice gruff and steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched on, making the air feel thicker. Then the transmission came through again, but this time the voice was more distant, like it was coming from the far reaches of space. "It's not about what I want, Renner," the voice said, its tone now laced with a strange mix of warning and command. "It's about what you'll do. Return what you've taken, and there will be no consequences. Keep it, and you'll regret it." Before Jack could reply, the transmission cut off, leaving him in a silence more oppressive than any storm. His heart pounded in his chest. The words hung in the air like a threat, but they made no sense. What had he taken? He hadn't stolen anything. But then his mind went back to the girl, the crystal she had offered him. He hadn't taken it from her. He had just refused to accept it. Jack shook his head, dismissing the thought. This was getting ridiculous. Someone was just messing with him, trying to get into his head. He needed to focus. He had a job to do. But as he settled back into the cockpit, a strange feeling tugged at him. The unease he had felt earlier now seemed more like a warning, a whisper at the edge of his mind that wouldn't let him ignore it. He glanced over at the crystal, still resting in his pocket. Before he could even think about reaching for it, the ship jolted. The sudden shake threw him forward against the controls, and a flash of light streaked past the viewport. Jack's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a meteor or debris. No, this was something much bigger. Outside the window in the distance, a massive shadow seemed to distort the very fabric of space itself. It was a ship, but unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Its shape was almost organic, like something from a nightmare. Dark, sleek, and curving in ways that defied logic. It seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, radiating a sense of power that made Jack's blood run cold. Before he could react, a beam of light shot out from the unknown ship, striking the side of the Iron Beast. The impact shook the ship, and alarms blared as the hull groaned under the pressure. Jack slammed his hand on the control panel, trying to regain control, but it was useless. The beam wasn't just a weapon. It was a force that disrupted his systems, pulling him off course, dragging him toward the alien vessel. Panic surged through Jack's veins. He wasn't prepared for this. He was just a trucker, a delivery man. He didn't have the skills or weapons to fight off an attack like this. His hands shook as he tried to manually adjust the ship's course, but the controls were unresponsive. The beam continued to drag him closer, the massive shadow of the alien ship looming ever larger. In the distance, a voice echoed through the ship's intercom, the same voice from the transmission. "You have been warned, Renner. Return what you've taken." Jack gritted his teeth, refusing to give in to fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted into the empty cabin. "I didn't take anything." But there was no time for explanations. The ship was almost upon him, its dark silhouette now filling the entire viewport. As Jack's heart raced, the ship's lights flickered again, and the glowing crystal in his pocket pulsed violently, as though reacting to the alien ship's presence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the beam of light vanished. The ship released its grip on the iron beast, and the world seemed to return to normal. But Jack wasn't fooled. He knew he hadn't escaped unscathed. Whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning. He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the controls once more. The alien ship was gone, its shadow now a mere memory in the void. The silence was deafening, and Jack's mind raced. What was going on? Who were these people? And why did they want the crystal? He had no answers. But one thing was certain. The game had changed, and Jack was in deeper than he ever could have imagined. The strange girl, the glowing crystal, and the mysterious forces that were now hunting him, it all pointed to something bigger, something he couldn't escape. But Jack Renner wasn't the kind of man to back down. If they wanted the crystal, they'd have to come and take it from him. A dark secret. The stillness of space was often the most unnerving thing about it. The silence wrapped itself around Jack like a heavy blanket, smothering his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly alone. The ship's systems had settled down after the attack, but that sense of unease, of being watched, still lingered like a shadow over him. As the iron beast cruised deeper into the galaxy, Jack's mind raced with questions. Who were the people in that mysterious ship? What did they want with the crystal? And why was everything happening so fast? It didn't add up. His instincts told him that this wasn't just some random encounter. Something bigger was at play, something he couldn't yet see. He glanced over at the console, trying to push the nagging questions out of his mind. He had work to do, a delivery to complete, focus on the task at hand. But as his fingers hovered over the navigation controls, something caught his eye. A new alert flashing on the screen. Incoming transmission. Jack frowned. The ship's communication systems had been pretty quiet since the attack. A transmission now, this late in the game, didn't seem like a coincidence. With a deep sigh, he keyed in the command to open the channel, bracing himself for another strange message or some kind of scam. But when the voice crackled through the speakers, Jack's blood ran cold. "You should have listened, Renner." The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an edge to it, something dark that made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck stand on end. He leaned forward, his fingers twitching toward the controls. "Who is this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "You've made a grave mistake," it said. "The crystal you hold is not just an object. It is a key to something far older and more powerful than you can comprehend." Jack's heart skipped a beat. What the hell are you talking about? He couldn't make sense of it. All he had was some glowing crystal he had taken from a desperate alien girl. A key to what? "The crystal belongs to the Zykor," the voice continued, its tone growing darker. "They have waited millennia for it to return. And now it has. But in your hands, it is a threat. The Zykor will stop at nothing to reclaim it." Jack's mind raced. Zykor. The name meant nothing to him. But something about it felt ancient, like an echo from another time. And the fear in the voice of the person on the other end made it clear that whatever this crystal was, it was far more than a simple object. "Who are you? And why are you warning me?" Jack's voice was sharp now, the uncertainty that had been gnawing at him giving way to frustration. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Jack thought the transmission had cut off. But then the voice returned, quieter this time. "I am someone who has made the same mistake," the voice said softly. "I'd once held the crystal, thinking I could control it. But I was wrong. It is not meant to be controlled. It must be destroyed, before it consumes you." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Destroyed. He didn't know what the crystal was, but he sure as hell wasn't going to destroy it without knowing more. He gripped the edge of the control panel, his knuckles turning white. "I won't let you manipulate me," Jack spat. "If you're trying to scare me into giving it up, it's not going to work. I'm not some pawn in your game." The voice was silent for a long moment, as if weighing Jack's words. Then, finally, it spoke again, its tone cold and final. "You don't understand. It's already too late. The Zykor are coming. You can't outrun them. You can't hide from them. And no one will believe you when they find out what you've done. They'll come for you, and they will take the crystal back." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Jack staring at the silent screen, his heart pounding in his chest. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The Zykor, whoever they were, they clearly had a power beyond anything Jack had ever imagined. And if they were truly coming for the crystal, then things were about to get a whole lot worse. But there was something that gnawed at Jack's gut. The person on the other end of the transmission had warned him. They had seemed almost desperate. And yet, they hadn't told him who they were or how they knew all of this. It didn't make sense. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out the crystal. It glowed softly in his hand, almost like it was alive. He could feel its warmth, a strange kind of pulse, as if it was reacting to his touch. The girl's face flashed in his mind. Her pale blue skin, her bright eyes, the way she had looked at him when she'd offered him the crystal. Was she really just some innocent alien, or was she part of something much bigger? And what had she meant when she said, "You'll regret it"? Jack didn't have the answers. All he knew was that the stakes were much higher than he'd ever imagined. Whatever this crystal was, it was more than just a simple trinket. It was a weapon, a key to something dangerous. And now it seemed like everyone, from the mysterious voice to the alien race known as the Zykor, was coming for him. Jack's fingers tightened around the crystal, and he made a decision. There was no going back. He was in this now, and he would do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant facing the unknown horrors of the galaxy. The alien girl's true power. The quiet hum of the iron beast filled the cockpit as Jack tried to process the chaos that had unfolded over the past few hours. The transmission, the strange warning about the Zykor, and the crystal. It was all too much. His thoughts were tangled in confusion, but there was one thing that was becoming crystal clear. He couldn't outrun whatever was coming. Jack had always been a man who faced challenges head-on, but the weight of the unknown pressing down on him now was something different. He could feel the energy of the crystal pulsing softly in his pocket, almost like a heartbeat. He had no idea what it was, but one thing was for sure. He wasn't holding it. It was holding him. As Jack's fingers traced the edge of the control panel, a sudden flash of light broke through the darkness outside the cockpit window. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a ship. It was something else, something unmistakably alien. The glow grew brighter, and before Jack could react, the cockpit lights flickered and dimmed. The energy from the crystal was increasing, vibrating with intensity. He reached for it, pulling it from his pocket, unsure of what was happening, but feeling an undeniable pull toward the object. His hand was trembling now, the crystal seeming to draw the very air around it. Then, with a sudden jolt, the ship's entire hull vibrated. Jack felt a strange, almost magnetic force that pulled at his chest. The stars outside the window distorted for a brief moment, and before he knew it, he was no longer alone. There, standing in the doorway of the cockpit, was the alien girl. She hadn't appeared out of thin air. No, she had materialized, as if the very fabric of space had bent to her presence. Her small frame was outlined by a shimmering aura of energy, and her eyes glowed with an intensity that Jack had never seen before. She wasn't the fragile girl he had met on that dusty planet. No, she was something entirely different now. Her clothes, once ragged, were now woven with an otherworldly pattern that pulsed with life. She stood tall, unafraid, her eyes locked onto Jack, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. "You?" Jack started, his voice hoarse from disbelief. "How did you? What's happening?" The girl's gaze softened, and she stepped forward, her feet barely touching the ground, like she was floating in the air. "I warned you, Jack Renner," she said, her voice calm but filled with power. "You have been carrying something that doesn't belong to you. Something much more dangerous than you can understand." Jack's heart hammered in his chest. What are you? Who are you really?" The girl smiled, her eyes gleaming with a strange light. "I am part of a force that has existed for millennia. My people, my true form, are ancient. The crystal you hold is not simply an object. It is a fragment of the universe's power, a key to unlocking the energy of the stars themselves." Jack took a step back, confusion turning into fear. You're not just some lost traveler, are you?" "You're not just anyone," she interrupted. "I was sent to find the crystal, to protect it, to stop it from falling into the wrong hands." Her gaze sharpened, the air around her crackling with energy. "The Zykor are coming, but they won't stop there. They will use the crystal to reshape the universe in their image. They will destroy everything in their path. But it's not too late. You can stop them, Jack." Jack's mind raced. The crystal, the warning, the mysterious girl, it was all too much to process. But one thing was clear now. This wasn't a simple delivery job gone wrong. This was bigger, much bigger, and he had somehow found himself at the center of it all. "You want me to stop them," Jack said, his voice rising in disbelief. "I'm a trucker, lady. I'm not some hero. I can't just take on an entire race of super-powerful aliens." She shook her head, her expression softening. "I'm not asking you to fight them, Jack. Not directly. The crystal has power, more than you can imagine, but only if you unlock its true potential. You are the key now. You are the one who can stop the Zykor from using it to destroy everything." Jack's mind was spinning. Unlock its potential. What did that even mean? How was he supposed to control something he didn't understand? He gripped the crystal tightly, and for the first time, he could feel the weight of it, not in his hand, but in his soul. The energy it held was overwhelming. It felt alive, and it was drawing him in. "You're the one who can awaken it," the girl continued, her voice almost pleading. "You have the strength, the courage, the will to unlock its power." Jack looked at her, uncertainty clouding his thoughts. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm the right person." Her eyes softened, and she took a step closer. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to make the right choice. Use the crystal. Trust it. And together, we can stop the Zykor from bringing about the end of everything." Jack stood there, staring at the girl, then at the crystal in his hand. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to be one. But something deep inside him told him that this moment, this choice, was something that couldn't be ignored. The universe had thrust him into this fight, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. He took a deep breath, letting the energy of the crystal fill him. "All right," he said, his voice steady but full of determination. "Let's see what this thing can do." And with that, Jack Renner took the first step into a new and dangerous world. A world where the stakes were higher than anything he could have imagined. The girl's power was undeniable, and the crystal was far more than just an object. It was a weapon, a key to an ancient force, and now it was in his hands. The real battle had only just begun. The trucker's debt. The quiet of space had never felt so oppressive. Jack sat motionless in the pilot's seat, his grip still tight around the glowing crystal that now seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The girl, no, the being, who had once appeared so fragile and innocent, had transformed into something far more formidable. Her words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over like a warning that wouldn't fade. You are the one who can stop them. The Zykor, the mysterious alien race that had apparently been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to hold the key to their power. Jack had never signed up for anything like this. He wasn't some chosen hero. He was a trucker, a delivery man, just trying to make it through the galaxy without too many complications. But now, with the fate of the universe hanging on his next move, he could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. Jack looked over at the girl, who now stood by the viewport, her back turned to him. She wasn't looking at him, but instead gazing out at the stars, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. It was clear she wasn't just here for the crystal. There was something more to her, something ancient and powerful, and yet something that had been broken too. "What's your real name?" Jack asked, his voice low. She turned to face him, her eyes glowing faintly. "I have many names, Jack Renner, but the one that matters now is Ilyara." "Ilyara," Jack repeated, feeling the weight of her name. It felt as if it held 1,000 years of history behind it. "Why didn't you tell me? What's going on? Why is this happening to me?" Ilyara's gaze softened, but there was still a trace of sorrow in her expression. She walked toward him, her movements graceful, almost as if she were gliding. She stopped in front of him, her presence almost overwhelming in the small cockpit. "Because, Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I couldn't let you know too much. Not until you were ready. The crystal is not just a key, it's a burden, a debt that must be paid. And now, it's yours to bear." Jack felt a tightness in his chest as her words sank in. A burden, a debt. This wasn't just some mission he could walk away from. This was something that had been set in motion long before he had ever stepped foot in the Iron Beast. "You mean I have to pay for taking this thing?" Jack asked, his voice rough. "What kind of debt are we talking about here?" Ilyara's eyes darkened, and she took a deep breath. "The Zykor will come for you, Jack. They've been hunting this crystal for centuries, and now that you've touched it, they'll stop at nothing to take it from you. You're not just a victim in this. You're part of a greater cycle, one that goes beyond your understanding." Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just about the crystal anymore. It wasn't just about some alien race wanting to control its power. There was something deeper, something tied to the very fabric of the universe itself. And Jack had unknowingly become a part of it. "The Zykor?" Jack asked again, though he already knew the answer. "What do they want with it?" "They want the crystal because it's the only thing capable of unlocking a power so ancient that it could reshape the universe itself," Ilyara explained, her voice steady now, as if she was finally revealing something she had been holding back for too long. A power that could destroy worlds, collapse entire star systems, and bend time itself. The crystal is a key to that power, and they believe they are destined to wield it. Jack's chest tightened at the thought. This wasn't just some treasure hunt. The Zykor weren't interested in riches or conquest. They were after something far more dangerous. "And you?" Jack asked, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you helping me? What's in it for you?" Ilyara's gaze grew distant, and for a moment, Jack could see a flicker of something old and painful in her eyes. "I was once like you," she said quietly. "A mere pawn in a game that was beyond my control. The crystal chose me to guard it. But the Zykor, they wanted to use it for their own purposes. They would have destroyed me if I didn't flee, if I didn't hide away from their reach. But now, I'm bound to the crystal in ways that cannot be undone. And you, Jack, you've become my only hope." Jack stared at her, his thoughts a whirlwind. She wasn't just a guide. She was trapped, just like him, caught in a web of power and destiny that neither of them had chosen. And yet now he understood that his fate was tied to hers in a way that couldn't be avoided. "So I'm supposed to just use this thing and stop the Zykor?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "How the hell am I supposed to do that? I'm not some warrior or sorcerer or whatever you are. I'm just a trucker." Ilyara's expression softened, and she placed a hand gently on his arm. "You have something they don't, Jack. You have the ability to make the right choice when it matters most. The crystal can't be controlled through force or power alone. It responds to those who are capable of understanding its purpose. You might not feel like a hero, but you are the one who can stop them." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was it, the moment when everything changed. He wasn't in control anymore. The crystal, Ilyara, and the Zykor, they were all part of a story that had been written long before he had ever set foot on this ship. But that didn't mean he had to like it. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Jack asked, his voice low. Ilyara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jack already knew the truth. The debt had been paid. And now the only thing left to do was survive the storm that was coming. The ultimate gift. The moment the words left Ilyara's lips, Jack knew there was no turning back. He had become a part of something much bigger than himself, something ancient and unstoppable. The Zykor, the crystal, and the cosmic forces at play had all intertwined in a way that made everything Jack had ever known feel small and insignificant. As the iron beast cruised through the darkness of space, Jack looked out the viewport. The stars seemed to blur into streaks of light, as though the very fabric of reality had begun to stretch and twist around him. The ship's controls felt like a distant memory now, almost irrelevant. He could sense a growing power within the crystal, as though it were awakening, responding to something deep inside him. It was no longer a foreign object. It was a part of him. And whether he liked it or not, that meant he was bound to it. Ilyara stood beside him, her presence as overwhelming as ever. "The Zykor are closing in," she said softly, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. "They know you have the crystal. They won't stop until they get it." Jack nodded, his mind racing. The crystal had granted him no powers. He hadn't felt anything special in his hands, no sudden understanding of its true potential. But then again, he hadn't really had time to figure it out. Every moment that passed, the urgency in Ilyara's voice only deepened. They didn't have much time. The girl, no Ilyara, was more than she appeared. There was a deep, almost painful connection between her and the crystal. She had been tasked with guarding it, and now she had passed that responsibility on to Jack. He wasn't sure if that made him a hero or a fool, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was the only one who could stop the Zykor. And just when Jack thought it couldn't get any worse, a sharp beeping sound filled the cockpit. It was a warning, an alert. Incoming hostile vessel. The display flickered as the radar showed a fleet of ships closing in, their shadows creeping through the depths of space. Jack's blood ran cold as he recognized the shape of their vessels. They were Zykor ships, sleek, black, and terrifying, each one seemingly alive, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. "There's no time left," Ilyara said, her voice trembling. "They're here." Jack's hands tightened on the controls, but he wasn't sure what to do. He had no weapons, no way to fight. All he had was the crystal, and if the stories were true, it had the power to destroy entire worlds. But he had no idea how to unlock that kind of power. It was like trying to control a storm with nothing but a whisper. Suddenly, Ilyara stepped forward, placing her hand over his. Her touch was gentle but firm, as though she was guiding him without speaking a word. "Trust it, Jack. Trust yourself. The crystal will show you what to do." Jack looked down at the crystal, now glowing brighter than ever, casting strange, shifting patterns of light across the cockpit. It felt alive. He had been holding it for so long, but now, for the first time, he truly felt its presence. There was power here, raw and untamed, waiting for him to harness it. But how? He wasn't a sorcerer. He wasn't anything special. He was just a trucker who had gotten caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, as the Zykor fleet moved closer, something within him clicked. The crystal wasn't just an object. It was a living force, and it was calling to him. Ilyara's voice, low and soothing, echoed in his mind. The crystal chooses its bearer, Jack. It chose you. Now, accept your fate. Let it flow through you. With a deep breath, Jack closed his eyes, feeling the energy of the crystal flow through his hands and into his body. The ship around him seemed to pulse in response, as if the entire vessel was becoming part of the same force. For a moment, the weight of the universe pressed down on him, and then, with a sudden clarity, everything made sense. He was no longer just a trucker. He was a conduit for the crystal's power. The universe itself had opened up to him, its vast energy flowing through his veins. "Now," Iliara whispered, "show them your power." Jack didn't hesitate. His hands moved instinctively, and the crystal began to glow with an intensity he had never imagined. The ship's systems hummed with newfound life, and the very fabric of space seemed to bend and twist around him. He felt the power of the stars themselves at his fingertips. He raised the crystal, and the universe responded. Energy surged outward from him, rippling through the void, creating a wave of light that swallowed the incoming Zykor ships. Their sleek black vessels shuddered under the onslaught, their shields flickering and breaking apart like glass under pressure. The Zykor fleet tried to retaliate, but their weapons were useless against the force Jack had unleashed. The crystal wasn't just a key to power. It was the power itself, and Jack had finally learned how to wield it. The lead Zykor ship, larger and more imposing than the rest, tried to maneuver around the energy blast, but it was too late. Jack focused on it, and with a thought, the ship was consumed by the light, its massive frame disintegrating into nothingness. The remaining ships scattered, their crews scrambling to escape the sudden, overwhelming force that had come from nowhere. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath as the last of the Zykor fleet vanished into the stars. The cosmic energy Jack had released rippled out, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Jack sat back in his seat, his hands still trembling, the crystal dimming slightly in his palm. He could hardly believe what had just happened. He had done it. He had defeated the Zykor, not through battle or force, but through something far deeper. The crystal hadn't just been a tool for destruction. It had been a gift, a means of protecting the universe from those who would abuse it. Iliara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said softly. Jack didn't answer right away. He was still trying to grasp the enormity of what had just occurred. The crystal had chosen him, had guided him, and in return, he had stopped an entire fleet of Zykor. The power had been there all along, inside him, inside the crystal. All he had to do was trust it. He looked out at the stars, a sense of calm washing over him for the first time in what felt like forever. The battle was over. The debt had been paid. And for once, Jack Renner wasn't just surviving in the galaxy. He was shaping it. As the remnants of the Zykor fleet disappeared into the void, Jack knew that he had changed the course of history. The universe would remember this day. And for the first time in his life, Jack Renner knew he wasn't just a trucker anymore. He was something much more. And the journey ahead was only beginning.